What I'd first like to do is just tell you all a little bit about why I wrote the book. And to kind of set the stage, I look around here and I bet you a lot of you know as much or more about Vietnam than I do. But I'll just say a couple of things about it. It was a long war. It was 10 years at least. You could probably count 20 if you really looked at it closely. But it was 10 serious, bloody years. It was a different country back then in a lot of ways. And the topic that I think made it the most different just came up this evening when I was talking to Todd, the fellow who's doing some TV here, and that's the draft. The draft back in 1968, 69 was encompassing. It was something that was weighing on the thoughts of every young person in the country, especially the young men, also the young women who were trying to figure out what young men they might hook up with. 2.5 million Americans over that 10-year period wound up in Vietnam, helping somehow to fight the war. That was 10% of the boomers in Vietnam. 88% of the infantry in the Army were draftees, including myself. And boy, let me tell you, you got the basic training. Whether or not you're going to be in infantry was something you really thought about. A third of the casualties in Vietnam during those 10 years were draftees. The Army in Vietnam represented a maximum effort on the part of America to do something. I happen to think, and I think probably most of the people here agree, that it was a terrible thing they wanted to do, but still, it was this maximum effort. There were 500,000 troops in Vietnam for several years. And to put that in a little bit of perspective, that's the number of soldiers Napoleon took into Russia. It was a grand army, the army that was in Vietnam. And really, as you stop and think about it, a whole heck of a lot more powerful than Napoleon's army. When I got to thinking about this book, what really triggered it was a visit by a friend who had just been in Vietnam. The Army let him come back to visit his premature baby. And it was an unusual thing where they normally didn't let somebody interrupt their tour of duty, especially if you were one of the guys humping the boonies like Don Fancher. But anyway, he came back, and we were at Fort Lewis, and he flew through there, and so he came and stayed with us in transit, waiting to go home to Sacramento to visit his wife and baby. And that night, Don told me a story. And that became the name of this book. I changed it to So Long Vietnam to kind of make it a little more clear. But for years, I called it Don's Story. And the reason was that Don told me that when they received notification that they were going to go into Cambodia in an invasion, it really threw his whole company into a tizzy. And I'm not saying that it wasn't happening all over the American Army then. He was a part of the 4th Division, which was assigned up in the Parrot's Beak, not in the heaviest fighting, but still they were very concerned about having to go into this new battle. One of the members of their company took his M16 and locked and loaded, which meant that the thing was ready to fire, automatic, 20 rounds if anybody messed with him. And he didn't say anything. He just sat down under a banana tree and refused to talk. And officers and other sergeants surrounded him and were trying to talk to him, trying to figure out what to do. And when his friends and the rest of the company got word that this was happening, they decided to hold a meeting. About half the company, they were mostly like what they called the bros and the heads. The black guys, the brothers, and the heads, it referred to people who liked marijuana, but it was also people who didn't think the war was so hot. So the bros and the heads met on the hillside. And the topic of discussion was, should we go into Cambodia? should we fight this war for them? I mean, doggone it, we've been fighting all these years in Vietnam, and now they want us to go into Cambodia. So, the person who was in charge of this company, I think, was a really competent officer. And instead of confronting any of these guys, he knew they had a point. He just called division and said, you better get the helicopters here as soon as you can. And because we got to get these guys loaded up and out of here before they get organized. And that's how it happened. The helicopters came, my friend Don and the rest of his buddies got on, and including the guy under the tree. Everybody got on and went into Cambodia. For years, I thought about this meeting and thought about the fact that these American soldiers, these grunts, these rank and file guys, these draftees, were sitting there thinking about taking things into their own hands. And so it led me to speculate, well, what would happen if American soldiers had really decided to take things into their own hands? And that led me to try to write a story. And so in my story, the captain in charge wasn't such a sharp guy. He was more like some of the commanding officers that I knew here at Fort Lewis, and confronted those soldiers. And what would happen if they were confronted and they stood up to him and they decided, hey, this war has to stop. We're going to have a mass movement to stop the war. And that's the basis of my story. So, anyway, I just thought I'd read a few things from the book to you guys to introduce you to a few of the characters. December 8th, 1969. 3 days later, the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Light Infantry Brigade, 4th Division, was moving out with barely enough time to assign the new guys their bunks. Dunlop got up early that morning to pack his rucksack. He tried to think of everything he might need while they were out on patrol. The resulting pile of stuff turned out to be more than enough for 3 packs. He culled the pile down to the bare essentials and stuffed them in his rucksack. After a breakfast that he hadn't felt much like eating, Frank grabbed his gear. He found the other guys in 3rd Platoon, 2nd Squad, assembled in the shade of their mess hall, waiting for the Slicks, transport helicopters, to pick them up for the planned operation. FNG, parentheses, fucking new guy, Frank Dunlap, stood among a group of 7 grunts in jungle fatigues, puffing nervously on his 3rd cigarette in 25 minutes. He was starting to feel a little dizzy from the nicotine. I just thought of something that I meant to do before I started reading, and that's to tell you that some of the language that we used is objectionable. And I decided to write the book as we really talked in the Army in those days. And so I want to apologize if I make somebody feel bad saying these things. I'm not doing it for that. I'm doing it to really try and give a sense of the story and have it be authentic. He was starting to feel a little dizzy from the nicotine. Today, December 8th, 1969, marked the end of his first week in Vietnam. He was as shiny and new a trooper as could be found in this part of the Central Highlands today. But being new around here wasn't usually a very good thing. Dunlap's jungle fatigues were deep green without even a frayed area to alter the new guy impression. He hated that he looked like such an inexperienced, ignorant kid, fresh from the world. He averted his eyes from the guys lounging by the mess hall as he scratched and fidgeted, fearing they might notice the admiration in his gaze. They were all such grizzled veterans, leaning, squatting, and sitting in the shade with their gear stacked casually in front of them. They all seemed lost in thought, confident in their ability to survive the murderous battles they would face in the coming weeks. The 3rd Battalion was preparing itself for an operation that would keep it out in the rolling hills of central Vietnam for at least the next month. All the officers and senior sergeants of the 4 companies assigned to the extended field maneuver seemed to be frenetically checking details, hollering at subordinates, looking and talking tough for each other. The grunts by the mess hall found this spectacle mildly amusing, if they noticed at all. It's going to be one fine Christmas this year, Dunlap decided. He wondered with a chuckle if Santa would bring them presents if they were still out on Christmas Day. Dunlop squatted alone amidst his stacked gear and began tightening the laces on his boots. I'm not sure exactly how I feel right now, he thought, but I think it's some version of scared shitless of going to war. Sergeant Roland Peterson, leader of 2nd Squad, 3rd Platoon, D Company, gave up his favorite shady place under the mess hall window and strolled over to where Dunlop was standing. You better rub some dirt into that new boot leather you're wearing there, troop. Peterson stood in front of Dunlop with his legs spread in a casual athletic stance and took off his bush hat, wiping the sweat from his brow with his forearm. Those toes are so fucking shiny, you might as well be wearing mirrors. Attracts the wrong kind of attention out there. Know what I mean? Raleigh Peterson looked like a guy running a highway construction crew in California's Central Valley. The tall sergeant was handsome and confident and always on the alert for the possibility of disaster. Dunlop had heard from sources around 3rd of the 8th that Peterson was the best squad leader in the battalion. Frank flipped his cigarette on the ground as he hunkered down and began rubbing some of the local red mud onto the toes of his boots. You from California, Dunlop? How'd you guess? The new troop looked up, smiling at the question. Oh, forget that steers and queers shit, man. There's been a lot of new guys in the battalion from Cal lately. That's enough. Huh? Dunlop looked confused for a moment. Oh, yeah. He stood up and looked down at his toes. Now you're starting to look like something besides fresh meat for Victor. Victor? Victor Charlie, the guy in the black pajamas who wants to make your wife glad you took out that extra life insurance policy before they dropped you into this shithole. Oh, that Victor. Frank smacked his lips, feeling a little dry in the mouth. Now, if it's okay with you, let's have a look at what you got in that rucksack. Peterson squatted, and before Dunlop could respond, opened the bulging pack and pushed the top items aside. He looked up and gazed into the distance for a moment, his brow furrowed, jaw set. Then he tipped the pack upside down and shook till all its contents were on the ground between the two men. Sorry, guy. Peterson gave the astonished Dunlop a comforting nod, and then went to work sorting the gear into 2 piles. Frank cast a furtive glance over his shoulder toward the rest of the squad, still lounging in the shade, cigarettes dangling from their expressionless faces. They were watching Peterson's inventory of Dunlop's things, and they all seemed to be at least mildly interested in the show. Hey, Raleigh, give you a good price for his stash when you find it. PFC Bill Van Dyne, known as Lizard, rocked on his steel pot, took a puff from his smoke, and laughed at his own joke. Van Dyne always seemed high on something or other. When he wasn't high, he was usually pretty nervous, tapping out the beat to some song only Lizard could hear. Van Dyne wasn't what you'd call a popular soldier. Several of his fellow squad members had accused him on different occasions of stealing from their footlockers. None of the thefts had been proven, but Peterson believed it would be only a matter of time before the guy got nailed. Upon his arrival, he had informed some of the squad that he had escaped a breaking and entering charge by joining the Army. Besides, it was widely believed that the slimy Van Dyne cheated at West. Say, new guy, you look like you're going to the prom, man. PFC Frank Burkowski from St. Louis stood and pointed to the gear in front of Dunlop. Anybody with that many pairs of pants must be planning on dancing with the gooks. And let me tell you, man, that ain't what they got in mind for your young ass. Peterson looked up at his squad, frowned, and said, why don't you guys just shut the fuck up? Can't you see I'm trying to get the guy squared away? And then we'll go ahead a little bit here in time. January 10th, 1970, your punishment is you got to go to Vietnam. PFC Tom Kelly stood with his hands at his side in a casual approximation of the attention position, along with 4 of his fellow soldiers at Fort Lewis. The expressions on the GI faces gave away little of what was on their mind. They had all been told at morning formation to be at the CO's office at the end of their workday, and Kelly figured he and the others knew pretty much what was up. Kelly was starving and exhausted from a heavy day's work at the logistics center. He felt rumpled and dirty in his GI fatigues, a marked contrast to the crisp and authoritative appearance of his commanding officer. He decided to concentrate on looking as unconcerned as his 4 black friends. Captain Wilcox was pissed off. He stood behind his desk and studied a sheet of paper that seemed of great importance to his command, the 543rd Supply Company. Finally, he looked up and fixed his gaze on the 5 silent soldiers in front of him. "You men have made a giant mistake with this. Petition, sir," Kelly interjected. "Yes, petition." Wilcox swung his gaze onto Kelly. The captain's pale, pinched face was expressionless, except for his upper lip, which curled slightly. "That's correct, Private Kelly," he said slowly. Wilcox returned his attention to the other 4 men. "This paper may seem innocent enough to the casual observer." Wilcox raised his fist to his mouth and cleared his throat. "One might even say that there is some merit to the opinion stated," he continued, hitting his stride like an angry minister in the middle of a sermon. "I'm sure that you 4 men had honorable motives for promoting this document." His body language made it clear which men he was addressing now, and Kelly could see that he was not one of them. Kelly knew the other soldiers on the carpet with him were just as responsible for the success of the petition as he was. All young black fellows, they felt strongly about a punishment that had been slapped on one of the brothers in the company. It was unjust and unnecessary, and typical Army harassment with an added racial twist. Private Daniel P. Wilson had not cleaned a toilet to the satisfaction of one of the lifers. When the sergeant discovered Wilson reading a book instead of cleaning the toilet for a 3rd time, Wilson was assigned to a humiliating punishment detail that extended well beyond the day he was supposed to get out of the Army. The absolutely worst thing that could happen to any GI was to have his ETS, parenthesis, estimated time of separation, date extended, especially when he was short, like Wilson, with only a month to go. That was a big mistake on the part of the Army. The petition had been Kelly's idea, and Gunner Fernley, one of the 4 guys now in the captain's office with him, had run with it. Fernley quickly wrote a statement and organized a dozen GIs, all black, to take copies around the fort and ask their fellow soldiers to sign them in support of Wilson. Kelly had not expected much would come of his petition, but he thought it was worth trying. For Kelly, it was mostly something to brag about at an upcoming Progressive Labor Party meeting for local GI members. Nobody was more surprised or more worried than Kelly once the ball got rolling. Theoretically, they could all go to jail for a long time. Altogether, 119 signatures were collected over 4 days. At the headquarters building, the same 5 young men gave the petitions to Major Hadley, their battalion commander. Wilson's punishment was rescinded the following morning. "But despite the obviously good intentions in this statement," Wilcox went on, "I wonder what you would say if I told you that one member of this group in front of me is neither a good soldier nor a good American." He looked slowly at each of the 4, avoiding Kelly, and then placed the petition on the desk. The faces of the enlisted men on the carpet remained blank. "As a matter of fact, I have received reliable information that Private Kelly here has joined his country's enemies and become a communist." Wilcox uttered the last 3 words in a slow whisper. Then he smiled slightly. "What do you say to that, Private Washington?" "I don't know about communists, sir," Washington answered. "I was mostly worried about Wilson." Silence for a few moments. "What about you, Gallon? Anything you'd like to add to what Washington just said?" "No, sir." Gallon's lips hardly moved, and his eyes appeared fixed on an object behind and slightly to the left of Wilcox. "Fernley?" Wilcox seemed a little less sure of himself now. "No, sir." Fernley looked straight ahead respectfully. "We was wanting to help Wilson, sir." "And you, Private Tebow?" Captain Wilson set his jaw and leaned forward toward Michael Tebow from Louisiana, his thumbs and fingers pressing on his desktop. "What do you think about the fact that Private Kelly is a self-proclaimed communist. Kelly closed his eyes and tried to concentrate on what Becky had fixed for dinner the night before. Cheeseburgers, his favorite. Tebow switched his hat from one hand to the other, sniffed, and said, "Well, sir, I guess I would say that if all communists do like Kelly, then I'm probably one myself." Wilcox slipped a little on the desktop, then straightened up and set his jaw. The 5 men stood around the captain in silence. And we'll go forward here a little bit. Again, this chapter is one way to get out of Long Bin jail. "I want this fool out of my jail." Major Thelonious Watkins' strident voice was surprisingly high for such a large and fearsome-looking man. He had worked hard throughout his 18 years in the Army and had done well for a black soldier. He had risen from the ranks to his current post as commander of the U.S. Army Stockade, Vietnam, located near Long Bin, known among the troops as Long Bin Jail, or LBJ. A stay at Major Watkins' facility was considered to be about the only thing in Vietnam worse than humping the boonies with your unit. After nearly a month at LBJ and the previous week in solitary, Private Willie Tuggins was thinking that he just might be glad to get back to a line unit. Judging by what was being yelled in front of his cell, he figured his jail time would be coming to an end soon. "But sir, we're looking into some very serious charges against this prisoner." First Lieutenant Darrell Johnson was red-faced as he spoke to his commanding officer. The anxious prisoner watched the 2 officers argue over his fate through a small window in the cell door, normally used for passing meal trays. Only a thick metal door separated the 3 of them. Tuggins bent over to look out and turned his head from one side to the other to follow what was being said. "Sir," Johnson's voice shook as he spoke, "I have 2 of my best men in the hospital from beatings that I believe this man encouraged other prisoners in this facility to administer." "That's exactly my point, Lieutenant." Watkins' words were slow and precise, his expression a glare at the young lieutenant. The veins in his temples looked ready to pop out of his head. He was a large and powerful man who reminded Tuggins of a massive bull named Bill that his father had purchased for breeding when he was a small boy. "I want this asshole out of here. And until that happens, you know as well as I do that this facility is going to be less and less under our control." "He's right, you know," Tuggins interjected, and both officers turned toward the prisoner for a moment with surprise and contempt curling their lips and distorting their faces. Tuggins smiled, trying to look as pleasant and respectful as he could. "Sir, I cannot accommodate your wishes at this time, sir." Lieutenant Johnson nervously fingered the large brass key ring hanging from his black leather military policeman's belt. "If I were to do so, I don't believe that I would be in compliance with the code, sir," referring to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the legal Bible for military policemen. This current uproar at LBJ began after a month before in a sleepy Mekong Delta village. Private Willie Tuggins had the temerity to interfere with a couple of his fellow 9th Division soldiers who, according to their account, were in the process of searching a peasant's dwelling. Tuggins marched them out at gunpoint and brought them to a CO, accusing the 2 soldiers of attempted rape of a civilian noncombatant. This had not been the first occasion when Tuggins' views had come into sharp conflict with others in the unit. This time he had received a 3-month sentence to LBJ for his efforts. For the first 2 weeks, his stay in the notorious military prison had been largely uneventful. He had worked hard at blending in with the other prisoners. Wake-up was at 0500 for an hour of morning exercises under the watchful eyes of spit-shine guards who doled out verbal abuse while the other prisoners sweated and strained. The rest of the day consisted of boring and repetitive work assignments, scraping old wax off a floor with a dull razor blade for 13 hours, or maybe cleaning toilets in the officer's quarter with a toothbrush were common jobs. The food was much worse than what the soldiers received in the field. Meals were only a chance to sit for a while, no conversation allowed. At first, LBJ seemed like a more regimented basic training, awful but survivable. But then Tuggins learned about beatings of prisoners, especially by a couple of vicious guards who worked the night shift. What appeared to trigger the extreme punishments was anything other than groveling respect and obedience toward the guards. So Tuggins organized the guys in his barracks to resist the beatings by administering some of their own. The plan worked fairly well. The rough treatment ended for the most part, and the two worst offenders were put in the hospital. They served as an example to other guards that they were dealing with human beings and not animals. To no one's surprise, Tuggins was removed from his barracks and placed in a vacant wing of the facility, used for overflow solitary confinement when the main hole was full. But then a letter arrived from a South Carolina congressman with a copy to Willie, inquiring about Private Tuggins and urging Major Watkins to take steps to ensure fair treatment and safety for this prisoner. Private Tuggins, the congressman wrote, was the son of the Reverend Joseph Tuggins, an important community and black church leader in his South Carolina congressional district. The letter concluded with a paragraph informing the major of an upcoming congressional vote on a military funding bill and suggested that by a generous interpretation of the section time off for sentence for good behavior in the UCMJ, Private Tuggins could well be released and back to his unit before this important vote. Willie figured that Major Watkins could take a hint, so he watched the argument between the two men in front of his cell with a touch of humor. He was fairly confident that the outcome would be in his favor. Lieutenant Johnson, what I'm suggesting here is in full compliance with the UCMJ. Watkins spoke so quietly that both Tuggins and Johnson had to strain to hear his words. He thrust a thick paperback book toward Johnson. According to my reading, this prisoner is due for release today under provisions of the section in the manual regarding early release for good behavior. Johnson turned away from Watkins and took a step toward Tuggins' cell door. As he sorted through the keys on his ring, he said, "Sir, I believe that under your interpretation, we would release Ho Chi Minh himself if he were a prisoner in this cell today." He inserted a key into the lock and swung the door open. Watkins stood a few feet away with his arm folded across his broad chest. Tuggins stood at attention in the open door with a grin on his face. "Lieutenant, sir, I believe Ho Chi Minh died last fall," he said as politely as he possibly could. "So you really—" "That's enough, Private." Johnson moved closer and positioned himself so that his nose was almost touching Tuggins' face. Major Watkins bowed his head, brought a hand up to his forehead, and muttered, "Jesus goddamn Christ." He spun around and marched crisply back up the hall toward the main prison, carrying the UCMJ manual, still open, to the good behavior section. Its pages fluttered like a butterfly. "He's out of my jail by 1600, Lieutenant." The major's voice echoed through the building just before he slammed the door shut. So, I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavor of the book, and I hope that you decide you might get a little more interested in it. Thank you. I worked on it for a long time. When I calculated it once, it was about 17 years it took me to write it. And then I heard about this guy who wrote Matterhorn, that I'm sure some people are familiar with in the crowd, about Vietnam. And he did his for, I think, more than 20 years. He worked on his book. So maybe there's kind of a pattern there that old soldiers take a while, and we finally get between covers. So anyway, I'd like to take a few questions now if anybody's interested in having a discussion. And then we're going to have small group discussions a little bit. And I would suggest that from this book, I'd like to see people come to the idea that mass movements among everyday people are really powerful, that they could do huge good things. That's what my book is about. As I'm sure everybody knows, we have some issues in front of us, like global warming and unemployment and others that are going to really require some mass pressure to do something about. So I hope that people will take that away from this book, that it's worth a try. it's worth a try to have a mass movement. So, any questions or any? Yeah, Steve.
So how much of your personal experience was woven into the book, and can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, the first half of the book, everything, I do it kind of like, if people remember Full Metal Jacket, where they did the training and then over at the war. And that's kind of how I did the book. And everything in training was just stuff that would happen. And I changed names a little bit. But it's all stuff that happened, like that meeting at the captain's office. And then everything up to the meeting on the hillside on the Cambodia border was really as it happened. And then from there, the last third of the book goes into the fiction. You know, my story about what if these guys had decided to march to Saigon. Ho Chi Minh said, yes.
So I know Stars and Stripes didn't carry the stories of mass protests in the stateside. So did you guys know about, GIs who were resisting stateside and
Oh, sure.
other folks? Yeah.
Oh, sure. I remember there was just a lot of ferment going on in those days. I've talked to some of the fellows, young men and women who are in the Army today. And one of the things I try to tell them is you just would have no idea about what the Army was like when I was in it. There, down at Fort Lewis, there was the shelter half, the coffee house, and Jane Fonda came to town, and there was all this stuff going on stateside. And there was actually quite a bit of stuff in Vietnam. And I highly recommend the movie Sir, No Sir. Yeah, it's a wonderful movie. That's who helped us get this picture for the cover of the book. It's about rebellions in Vietnam. There was actually some things that happened among some company-sized groups that refusing to do what they were told to do and stuff like that. Never really coalesced, but that's what I wanted to speculate on. Oh, sure. I remember one time. I didn't go to Vietnam, but I had my character that kind of represents me. That's where it got into fiction. I had him go to Vietnam. But I stayed here for a couple of years and learned how to be really good at picking up cigarette butts at Fort Lewis. I can tell you where they all were. But one time, there was a huge forest fire in Wenatchee. And, they wanted to use Army trucks to move the firefighters back and forth in the fire zone. And I was assigned to drive a big tow truck, 5-ton tow truck. But they didn't tell us it was for the fire. And I didn't know about the fire. And so they just said, you got to get ready, you're going to leave at 6 o'clock, and all that, because they love to do that kind of thing to show that you were really in the Army. And at the same time, there was I believe it was an American Legion convention in Portland, a national meeting that was, a lot of people thought there was going to be huge demonstrations there and riots. And so I assumed that they were sending us down there to confront the demonstrators. And I firmly remember in the hallway yelling at my company commander, I'm not going to Portland for you. And that's when we found out that we were going to go to the fire instead. So, yeah, people did that all the time. Yeah, especially in the Army I was in. Now, I doubt if they do it that much today in the volunteer Army. Yes. Well, there's this character that I read a little bit about in the Willie Tuggins. He's based on a friend of mine who was just bowled me over. And he's the most morally inspiring character in the book. He's a black guy from South Carolina. And what I have in the book was, that I mentioned was that he saw some people being raped and, marched those guys out of there. And this guy, Huggins, had really done things like that. And he wasn't in Vietnam, he was in Korea. And he had also done things like I described him doing in LBJ, but he'd done them in the prison in Korea, in the Army prison there. But yeah, he had a strong moral sense that I like to center the story around, because he becomes the leader of this group of GIs. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that was mentioned to us more than once in training, was that, you don't fight for your country, you fight for your buddy. And, because, people get really close to one another in terrible situations, and they want to look out for one another. I think I might have included some of that in there. There's this one conversation I have take place where these guys are talking to, the character kind of represents me, about, look, when we get in firefights, you got to fight. And it's like at this really elemental level of buddies trying to do that. The group of soldiers that I use as the basis of this book were up in the Central Highlands, the 4th Division. And, they mostly tramped around and didn't run into much in the years that the book represents. My friend was there. Not like the poor guys in the 9th Division down in the Delta who got into stuff every day and witnessed all manner of horror. Yeah, I think so. I think that at the point that they decided to pull the Army out, it was either pull them out or really have things like this happen. I think the best indication of that is to ask high-ranking military officials and Pentagon people and stuff, what do you think about a draft? And they'll look at you with horror. Are you out of your mind? We're never going to draft people again. And it's very important to understand how a drafted Army is going to be totally different. I mean, we were normal, everyday people who were forced to do what we're doing. We didn't volunteer for it. Yes, ma'am. Well, people do things that are in their interests. I know that. And I think one thing to keep in mind is the scale of things. And, when you're talking about in Vietnam, before there were drones and smart bombs and, the Apache helicopters had gotten so well turned out, there was, the North Vietnamese Army was huge. And they were in terms of a tradition, the Vietnamese were one of the most experienced, fiercest fighters in Asia. I mean, they'd had to be, because China, and then people come in this way, people go, so that if we tried to do it with mercenaries, there wouldn't be enough of them. You had to have 500,000 guys and put them out there and say, look, either fight or you get killed. And that's the way it would work. They'd send guys like my friend Don tramping around the hills until they would get attacked, and they were bait, so that then they'd bring air in and try to kill whoever had attacked them. But you couldn't do it with just a few mercenaries. I might just mention, I might just mention real quickly that an idea I've had about the Iran sanctions business is that seems to me there's a tremendous amount of worry about the Iranians building a nuclear bomb. And that's at the basis of our conflict with Iran right now, the centrifuges and all that. And I really think that Americans, particularly American Jews, which I count myself at least half a member of that group, my wife is a full member, my son too, American, and my daughter-in-law. American Jews have a special role to play, I think, in that. It would be, I think, one of the healthiest things we could do is call for a fulfillment of the non-proliferation treaty that has been signed by most of the countries in the world, not Israel, but calling the Israelis to sign it. And in that treaty, they call for a nuclear weapons-free Middle East. And could you imagine, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could say, look, the Israelis are getting rid of theirs, so you guys don't have to build any, do you? And see what happened.
Israel has over 200.
Right, of course they do. And I think Americans could really try to encourage, especially American Jews, could try to encourage Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty and agree to a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Tremendous amount of sentiment inside Israel to have peace with Iran. There was a wonderful story last year where people were sending those email postcard things, you know, the pictures saying how much they love Iranians, and Iranians sent stuff back, we love Israelis, and it was really nice. It was really nice. There'd be a lot of support there if American, and especially American Jews, would really get behind that, I think. Yes, sir. Yes. Like I said, I had my characters really take a stand. In order to be able to coalesce this mass movement, they had to. It takes somebody like Martin Luther King or Willie Tuggins to bring people together, and not just that, because it also is in the interest of these people, and also, well, what are we going to eat tomorrow, and things like that too. But yes, people in my story and in my recollections from the Army days, there was a lot of moral concerns about what was going on in Vietnam. Yeah. People were really comfortable with me. I never had any trouble with guys, and I was the most vociferous anti-war guy you could imagine among my friends, so much so that when the Army's criminal investigation people came and investigated me, or some high Pentagon guys in suits, I was told, they weren't in uniform, came and investigated me. They called the guys down from my squad. They said, well, we're going to give King this really responsible job. You know, do you think can he handle it? It'd be a tremendous high security job. And they just wanted to get him talking about me. And apparently they all just said, oh, he'd be fine. And I've, for all this time, you know, and that's what they told me. They came over, when they came back to the barracks, they told me they'd covered for me. And all these years, I figured that's why I didn't go to Vietnam. Because, you know, they figured, oh, geez, if this guy can get his buddies to cover for him, he's liable to really cause trouble over there. So, yeah, but it was, they appreciated my moral stance. They did. Yes, ma'am. Well, I think it's really important to have adults involved. They provide a real anchor for young people. That was my experience back in those days. You know, the story is about these young guys that don't have adults around. They had to figure out how to coalesce without any adult leadership, really. And so, yeah, they were, you know, they were scared, but you get to a point where, you know, you hear about enough stuff and you see enough stuff, you think, well, the heck with it. You know, if I don't do this, I'm liable to get killed anyway. So let's just go ahead and try it. And it's that kind of thing, the way I think a lot of young guys would do. I really agree with you about both points, about terror and about JFK. I mean, I'm really fascinated by the history of Kennedy and the assassination. I was reading this review. It's one of the finest things I've seen on Kennedy, on Consortium News. It's a great website. This guy wrote a review of Chris Matthews' book about Kennedy and just ripped it to shreds because he says Matthews just tried to make Kennedy into a regular center-right Democrat, and he wasn't. And he included this one passage that I loved about Kennedy, where he had decided that Vietnam was impossible, that we'd never be able to win there because it was a nationalist struggle, and we were just fighting the entire people there. And so he came up with this National Security Memorandum 262, which was a plan to get out of Vietnam not long before he was killed. And he gave McNamara the essence of it, and was sending him out to tell the press about it. And as McNamara was leaving the room, he said, "And tell him that includes all the helicopter pilots." You know, I mean, I really like the just kind of down-to-earth stuff that Kennedy would do, and I think they killed him about several of those things. I think the main issue was Vietnam. I think they really wanted to do Vietnam, and he wasn't going to let them do it. And boy, you look at what happened when Johnson took over, and they started stacking bodies up over there. That's what happened.